The most feared military units in history were not defined only by their weapons, but by the psychological impact they had on their enemies. Few embodied that reputation more than the warriors of Sparta. The Spartans were not simply soldiers raised for war. They were a society built entirely around it. Beginning in childhood, Spartan boys entered the agoge, a state-controlled training system designed to strip away weakness and instill absolute discipline. Hunger, pain, and hardship were not avoided, but deliberately imposed, creating fighters conditioned to endure what others could not. By adulthood, Spartan warriors fought as hoplites within the phalanx formation, a tightly locked wall of shields and spears that required trust, coordination, and unwavering composure under pressure. Individual bravery mattered, but cohesion mattered more. A single break in formation could mean collapse, and Spartans were trained never to yield their position. Their reputation spread across Greece, not only because of battlefield effectiveness, but because of their cultural commitment to victory or death. The phrase attributed to Spartan mothers, born to return with their shield or on it, reflected an expectation that retreat was dishonor beyond acceptance. This mindset became legendary during the Battle of Thermopylae in 480 BCE, where a small Greek force led by King Leonidas, including 300 Spartans, held off a vastly larger Persian army for days. Though ultimately defeated, their resistance cemented the Spartan image as warriors who would stand regardless of odds. More than tactics or equipment, it was this combination of discipline, training, and psychological resolve that made the Spartans feared. Enemies did not just face trained fighters, they faced opponents shaped from childhood to accept sacrifice, maintain formation, and confront battle without hesitation. While the Spartans became symbols of individual warrior discipline, another force would come to dominate the ancient world through organization and adaptability: the Roman legions. Unlike armies built around temporary alliances or seasonal campaigns, the Roman military evolved into a professional institution. Legionaries were trained, equipped, and structured under a standardized system that emphasized coordination over personal heroics. Each soldier understood his role within a larger mechanism designed to operate efficiently across diverse terrain and conditions. Roman battlefield strength came from flexibility. Units could reorganize quickly, construct fortified camps overnight, and maintain formation under chaotic circumstances. Equipment such as the scutum shield and gladius sword complemented tactics that favored close engagement, while formations allowed ranks to rotate during combat, sustaining pressure on opponents who eventually tired or broke. Beyond combat itself, logistics and engineering amplified their effectiveness. Roads, bridges, and siege works enabled campaigns far from home territory, projecting power across Europe, North Africa, and the Near East. This capacity for sustained expansion reinforced the perception that resistance to Rome was rarely temporary. Defeat often meant absorption into a growing empire. Encounters with the legions left lasting impressions on their adversaries. Accounts describe the psychological impact of facing disciplined lines, advancing in unison, shields interlocked, movements deliberate and controlled. Where other forces relied on momentum or intimidation, Roman power projected inevitability. Their reputation was cemented over centuries of conflict, from the Punic Wars to the conquest of Gaul, where structured command and relentless persistence allowed Rome to overcome both organized states and irregular tribal resistance. Even in defeat, the system adapted, analyzed, and returned refined. The Roman legions were feared not solely for battlefield violence, but because they represented continuity, a military machine capable of learning, rebuilding, and advancing again. To face Rome was often to confront not just an army, but an expanding structure of power that rarely disengaged once committed. As Rome's influence eventually faded, other martial traditions emerged, shaped not only by warfare, but by philosophy and identity. In feudal Japan, the samurai became one of the most recognized warrior classes in history, feared as much for their discipline as for their presence on the battlefield. The samurai were more than armed, retainers serving regional lords. They occupied a defined social role structured around loyalty, hierarchy, and personal conduct. From an early age, training emphasized weapon mastery, situational awareness, and emotional control. Combat readiness extended beyond technique, incorporating mental composure, intended to prevent hesitation when confronted with danger. Central to their identity was the concept later described as Bushido, an ethical framework valuing honor, duty, and acceptance of mortality. While interpretations varied across eras, the expectation of commitment to one's lord, even at great personal cost, contributed to a reputation for resolve that influenced both allies and opponents. In warfare, samurai forces operated across chains changing tactical landscapes. Early conflicts emphasized mounted archery, mobility, and individual skill, while later periods saw engagement in massed infantry formations using spears and coordinated maneuver. Their adaptability across centuries of internal conflict allowed the warrior class to remain relevant despite technological and political shifts. The symbolic weapon most associated with the samurai, the katana, reflected craftsmanship and status as much as combat utility. Though popular imagination often centers on duels, battlefield encounters were complex and structured, shaped by terrain, alliances, and broader strategic considerations. Encounters with samurai armies conveyed both cultural distinctiveness and martial seriousness. Accounts from rival clans and later foreign observers described an adversary governed by ritual, hierarchy, and controlled aggression, factors that reinforced perceptions of unpredictability and determination. Ultimately, the samurai legacy endures not simply because of battlefield victories, but because their image merged combat function with cultural narrative. They came to represent an idealized warrior archetype, disciplined, loyal, and psychologically committed, contributing to their lasting position among the most feared and recognized military traditions in history. Centuries after the age of sword and shield formations, warfare entered an era defined by mechanization and speed. During the early years of the Second World War, few military developments generated as much fear and disruption as the German use of blitzkrieg tactics, driven by highly coordinated panzer divisions. Rather than relying on static lines or prolonged attrition, blitzkrieg emphasized rapid concentration of force. Tanks, mechanized infantry, artillery, and aircraft operated in coordination to break through defensive positions and exploit weaknesses before opponents could reorganize. This approach transformed battlefields into fluid environments where hesitation often resulted in encirclement or collapse. Panzer units became the spearhead of these operations. Designed for mobility and communication, they advanced with purpose, bypassing strong points and targeting logistical centers, command structures, and retreat routes. Their objective was not merely territorial gain, but systemic disruption, fragmenting an enemy's ability to respond coherently. Early campaigns demonstrated the effectiveness of this method. The invasions of Poland and France revealed how rapidly established defenses could unravel when confronted with concentrated, armored thrusts supported by air power. News of these advances contributed to a psychological dimension of fear, as both military personnel and civilians witnessed the speed at which traditional expectations of resistance were overturned. Beyond equipment, doctrine and coordination were decisive. Radio communication allowed flexible adjustment during engagement, enabling commanders to redirect momentum in real time. This adaptability, paired with aggressive maneuver, reinforced the perception that panzer-led assaults could appear suddenly and escalate beyond manageable scale. Opponents eventually developed countermeasures, and the limitations of blitzkrieg became evident as conflicts prolonged. However, its initial impact reshaped global military thinking. Mechanized combined arms, warfare would become a defining characteristic of modern conflict. The fear associated with panzer divisions was therefore rooted not only in firepower, but in the experience of confronting an adversary capable of collapsing. Fronts through speed, integration, and relentless forward pressure, marking a decisive shift in how war itself could be conducted. By the time the Knights Templar reached their peak, they had become more than soldiers. They were symbols, warriors bound by oath, discipline, and belief, and on medieval battlefields, that combination inspired both trust and terror. Formed during the Crusades, the Templars were tasked with protecting pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land, but protection quickly evolved into something far more formidable. They became elite heavy cavalry, heavily armored, relentlessly trained, and governed by strict rules that demanded obedience and fearlessness in combat. Unlike many feudal fighters, Templars did not break formation easily. Retreat was rare. Panic was unacceptable. Their identity was collective, not individual, a mindset that made them incredibly difficult to intimidate or scatter. On the charge, lines of mounted knights bearing the red cross could shatter enemy morale before steel even met steel. Their reputation spread across continents. To allies, they were guardians. To opponents, they were an unstoppable wall of conviction. Men believed to fight with divine purpose behind every strike, but their influence extended beyond the battlefield. Wealth, power, and secrecy surrounded them, building an aura that only amplified their mystique. And when their order was ultimately dissolved, legends only grew stronger. Because fear in warfare isn't always born from brutality alone. Sometimes it comes from certainty, from discipline, from belief so absolute that hesitation disappears. And that is what made the Knights Templar unforgettable.